Just after midnight on June 17th, 1939, a crowd of people began to form outside of this unremarkable building in Versailles, which is a city in France. The atmosphere in this crowd was electric. They all knew why they were there. They knew what they were about to see, but even still, there was a lot of nervous anticipation. And so as such, some people were coping with these nerves by drinking alcohol and trying to laugh and have a good time, while others were much more subdued and were trying to be respectful about what they were about to witness. Between 1 and 2 a.m., the doors of this unremarkable building opened up, and a group of men dressed in the same dark uniforms came out and didn't say a word to the crowd, and the crowd immediately went silent and began to back away from them. And this group of men, they walked right out in front of this building, and they had lumber and they had tools with them, and they began constructing this kind of strange wooden structure. And so the crowd, they wanted to get up close to see what these guys were doing, but at the same time, they didn't want to get too close. And so as the crowd formed a sort of half moon around these men that were doing the constructing were moving so seamlessly, like all of them had built this structure dozens of times before, and it was just muscle memory. And so by about 3 a.m., this structure was built, and they placed this large basket next to the structure, and then these men packed up their tools and the remaining pieces of lumber, and they turned around and they went right back inside the doors into the building and were gone. At this point, the crowd had become quite sizable outside of this building, and they were growing kind of restless because they knew now that this structure was built that the next time those doors open, the show is really going to start. This spectacle they are all there for, it's about to happen. And the crowd all knew that this event couldn't happen if the sun was up, because if the sun was up and the area was well lit, the press would be able to take pictures and film it, and that's not what officials wanted. They wanted this to happen in the darkness. But for whatever reason, things seemed to be getting delayed inside of this building. And so the crowd was just getting more and more restless. People are getting more and more drunk, and they're getting louder and more disruptive and boisterous. And then around 4:45 a.m., the sun had come up. And so the press was out in full force with their cameras trained at the doors of this building. And so the crowd really at this point is not actually expecting this event to take place, because at this point, it just seems totally unlikely. But at 4:50 a.m., those doors swung open, and standing in the threshold was 31-year-old Eugene Weidman, who was a convicted serial killer. His arms were tied behind his back, and the collar of his white shirt had been tucked down inside because they needed his neck to be free and clear because he was about to be beheaded. So the two guards on either side of Eugene, they pulled him forward out towards the crowd so the executioners behind him, who were dressed all in black, could filter out and take up positions alongside the guillotine, which is that wooden structure that had been built earlier in the morning. And so as Eugene is being brought out towards the crowd and everything is getting set up for his execution, the crowd went wild. They were shrieking and howling and laughing and pointing and booing and just generally being completely rambunctious and totally bloodthirsty. Eugene kept his head down. He did not want to look at the crowd, and he did not want to look at the guillotine. And so eventually the two guards turned him and walked him directly towards the base of the guillotine, at which point the executioners that had taken up their positions around this device, they grabbed him and slid him forward so he was on his stomach on top of this wooden platform, the guillotine, and they slid him forward until his head poked through this opening at the very far end, at which point his neck was positioned right under this huge blade that was dangling right above him, and his head was positioned over a metal bucket on the ground, which he would be looking directly at. At this point, the crowd was at a fever pitch, and one of the executioners pulled a lever, the blade came soaring down, and it removed his head fell into the bin, and the executioners pushed his torso into the basket that had been placed out there earlier, and then the executioners and the prison guards, they gathered up Eugene's body parts and went right back inside of the building, which was a prison. At this point, the crowd was cheering and going wild, and they ran up and began dabbing their scarves and their handkerchiefs in Eugene's blood, which was on the ground, as a sort of souvenir from having been at this execution. And of course, because the sun had been out for this entire spectacle, all of this had been captured on film. And so later that day, and for the next couple of days, the headlines all over France were about this bloodthirsty crowd that was cheering as this man was beheaded, and it just overall made France look really, really bad. And so French leaders decided that from that point forward, they could no longer do any more public executions. So the guillotine would continue to get used for decades beyond this point, but it was all behind closed doors. Also, random fact about being beheaded by a guillotine, your head, after it's been separated from your body, stays conscious for about 10 to 12 seconds, so they say. And apparently there's been lots of cases where the executioner, after the condemned has had their head removed, will yell the name of the person who has just had their head removed, and that person's head will look over at the person calling to them and will blink or try to mouth words for several seconds before the lack of oxygen kills the brain and then the head is no longer conscious. Here are some of the more notable pictures that were used in the media from Eugene Weidmann's execution. In the early 1900s, Eben Byers was a man who other people envied. He was born into a very wealthy family in New York City. He attended Yale University in Connecticut, which is a very prestigious Ivy League university, and he was devilishly handsome. After his college graduation, he didn't need a job because his family was so rich, and so instead he focused his time on a passion of his, which was golfing. And in time, he became this world-class golfer, going so far as to win the 1906 U.S. Amateur Tournament, which is the biggest amateur golf tournament in the world that most of the winners go on to become professional golfers. And so Eben most likely would have followed that path and become a pro golfer had his father not just handed over the very successful metalworking business that he started that made his family wealthy in the first place. And so Eben stopped his golf career and became the chairman of this incredibly successful company. And so overnight, he basically went from being just rich to being uber rich, making more money than he could possibly spend. But Eben did attempt to spend his money. He pretty much immediately began buying up luxury properties all over the country. He bought horse racing stables in the United Kingdom and in America, and he bought an entire luxury box at Forbes Field, which is where the Pittsburgh Pirates professional baseball team used to play. And so in addition to owning all these incredible things, Eben also, through his role as chairman of this company, began connecting with and befriending very powerful and influential people like the founders and executives at the Coca-Cola Company. And so all in all, Eben's life was really going quite well until 1927. That year, Eben was 47 years old, and he took some time off from gallivanting around the world and rubbing shoulders with famous people to go catch a football game at his alma mater at Yale University. So he hops on a train, he rides to Connecticut, he watches this game, and then afterwards he gets back on the train to head back to Pittsburgh. And this is a very long ride. It's over 12 hours long. And so Eben naturally bought a first-class ticket, and so he was inside of a train car that had bunk beds for passengers to sleep on during the ride. And so Eben climbed into a top bunk and he fell asleep. A few hours later, after the train is well on its way to Pittsburgh, Eben, in his sleep, manages to roll to the side of the bed and actually falls out of his bed onto the ground. He lands hard on his left side, it wakes him up, and as he stands up, he thinks he's okay, but then he feels this shooting pain in his left arm. So he's moving his arm around, he's not really sure what's wrong with it, but he's hoping it's just some bruising, and so he decides to get back into his bunk and just go back to sleep. And so he manages to fall asleep despite the pain, and then when they roll into the station in Pittsburgh several hours later, he wakes up and right away he feels that pain in his left arm. And so after getting off the train and going back to his house and dropping off his luggage, he went right to his physical therapist's office to ask him if there was anything he could do to help with the pain in his arm. And so the physical therapist examines Eben's shoulder and determines that, there's no structural damage to his arm, but obviously Eben is in pain. And so he says, look, there's a new product that came online that's quite expensive, but since you're a man of means, maybe it's something you want to consider. It's called Radathor, and it's supposed to dull aches and pains, and it's supposed to give you this huge boost of energy. And so, maybe you ought to try that. And so Eben was really excited at the notion of taking this new health tonic and said, yeah, let's do it. And so his physical therapist wrote him a prescription for Radathor. Eben took the prescription and he went to the drugstore. He picked up a half-ounce bottle of this liquid. He went back to his house and, as prescribed, he drank a very small spoonful of this liquid. And right away, he felt this surge of energy. The pain in his arm started to fade. All the things this health tonic claimed to be able to do, it was doing. And so over the next couple of days, Eben very diligently every day took the prescribed amount, a very small spoonful of this Radithor, and every day he felt better and better and better. Not just the pain in his arm, but overall he felt happier, he felt fitter, he felt alive, and he was attributing all those feelings to this miracle tonic. And so he began taking more and more of this tonic, well beyond what was prescribed, to the point where he was drinking 3 full bottles of Radithor every single day. And so for years he did this, and it was all going great until his jaw fell off. Literally, in 1931, one day, his lower jaw just separated from his skull and went slack. And so the reason this happened was because Radithor was actually just radioactive water. In the early 1900s, the radioactive element radium was believed to have highly curative properties with no side effects. And so naturally, at the time, dozens of health products were created with radium being their main ingredient. And Radithor was one of those products. It was literally just water and radium. And so after consuming over 1,400 bottles of Radithor over a 3-year period, Eben's body was finally just starting to disintegrate from the inside out. After he had his jaw surgically removed, along with large portions of his upper jaw, the rest of his body also just began to crumble. And so by the end of 1931, when his story was making headlines all around the world about the dangers of Radithor, and really more specifically the dangers of radium, Eben had become completely bedridden, and his skull was now beginning to disintegrate. There were holes forming all over his skull that were exposing portions of his brain. And so by 1932, Eben was dead. Eben was buried in Pittsburgh, and he was buried inside of a lead-lined coffin that was designed to absorb any of the radiation emitting from his bones. And then 30 years after he was buried, so in 1965, scientists actually exhumed his skeleton to see if it was still emitting radiation. And they determined it was still emitting the same levels of radiation as when he died. And they actually would ultimately figure out that radium, this radioactive element, has a half-life of 1,600 years. So what that means is Eben's body will remain highly radioactive for centuries. Here is a picture of Eben with his jaw surgically removed. It was taken shortly before he passed away. There is still some debate about what exactly happened in this story that I'm about to share with you. And so for transparency, in this video, I am going to rely on the narrative that was presented in court by the defendant. And so with that in mind, here we go. On the afternoon of December 3rd, 2012, a freelance photographer working for the New York Post newspaper named Umar Abbasi was walking down the stairs of the 49th Street subway station in New York City. This very busy station is located only a few blocks away from the very famous Times Square. And so after Umar made his way down to this underground subway station, he walked over to one of the big automated kiosks that looks like an ATM, and he purchased a subway ticket. And then with his ticket, he walked over to the turnstiles. He slid his ticket through the slot, pushed past the turnstiles, and was now standing out on the actual train platform. And from where Umar was standing, this platform basically was like a huge sidewalk that stretched all the way to his right a couple hundred feet and all the way to his left a couple hundred feet. And in front of this platform were the actual tracks down below, because the train, when it came out of the tunnel, it would actually come right up alongside this platform with almost no clearance between the platform and the train. As such, the leading edge of the platform, basically the lip of the train platform that's closest to the train tracks, has this big yellow line painted all across it to keep commuters from standing too close to the edge, because if the train came through, they could actually get hit by the train. And so as Umar is standing on this platform and he's looking left and right, it's totally crowded with people, and they're all kind of tucked back against the wall away from this yellow line. And so Umar decides he's going to turn right and wait at the right end of the platform, just because he saw down at the far end there appeared to be a gap in people, and he figured he could stand right there. And so Umar begins navigating past all of these people on the right side of the platform, and for the most part, everyone he is passing either has their head buried in their phone, or they're listening to music, or both. Because the thing about riding trains, especially trains in busy cities, is none of the commuters want to talk to anybody else. They want to be completely left alone. And so as Umar is walking, everyone was basically doing that, but at some point, he did pass two people that were engaged in a pretty heated conversation. Umar had no idea what they were arguing about, or if they were even arguing at all. He didn't know who these people were, but he took mental note of the fact that two men were kind of bickering with each other. And so he walked past them, didn't give it much of a second thought, and he arrived at a gap in the gaggle of people waiting for the train. And there he just stood well back of the yellow line, where he pulled out his camera and began clicking through the images he had taken earlier in the day at an earlier photo shoot. And so as he's clicking through these pictures, he starts to notice that those two men who had been bickering before are now straight up yelling at each other. They're screaming obscenities at each other. It's not clear who's fighting about what or who was the aggressor, but it's very obvious that at this point they're fighting. And so Umar looked away from his camera and looked left down the platform towards these two guys. And so these two guys are about 100 to 125 feet away from him. And all the people that were standing in the vicinity of these two men are beginning to migrate away from them. They just don't want anything to do with them. Because the thing about being in subways, especially in cities like New York, is there's lots of people that go down into these train stations that are inebriated or mentally unstable. And so very strange and bad behavior is just kind of a normal thing, and people tend to just kind of ignore it. And so that's what's happening. People are kind of walking away from these two fighting men, doing their best to pretend it's not happening. And so Umar spent a couple more seconds staring down the platform at these two men, but eventually just shrugged and thought, you know what, whatever problems they have, they're not mine. And so Umar went back to his camera and continued to click through his pictures, when all of a sudden he hears a scream coming from the left side of the platform. But it was not a scream that sounded like it came from either of these two men. And so Umar looked up from his camera and looked left down the platform, and now he just sees chaos. It's people running away from these two men. People are running to get away from whatever is happening around them. And so Umar's thinking these men must have come to blows and they're now fighting actively, physically with each other. But when finally the crowd kind of cleared for a second, he saw a woman pointing down at the train tracks right in front of where those two men had been standing. And so Umar looks at the woman and he follows her finger down onto the tracks, and he sees there is now a man, one of the two men who had been fighting, laying face down on the train tracks. And then, to Umar's horror, he looks up down the tunnel where the train would come out of, and he sees the headlights of the train. It is now coming into the station. And so Umar starts running down the platform to try to get to this man to pull him out of the tracks. And as he's running, he pulls out his camera and he turns the flash on and he holds the shutter down and he aims it at the train conductor to hope the flashing of his camera will alert the train conductor to put on the emergency brake and stop the train before he hits this guy down on the tracks. And so as Umar is running, trying to signal this train conductor, the man down on the tracks tries to stand up, and Umar sees he's really struggling to stand. And when he finally gets up, he turns and he grabs the edge of the platform and he tries to pull himself up and out of the tracks, but he doesn't have the strength or the coordination. And as Umar is getting closer and closer, but he's still too far away to help, he sees that this guy down on the tracks is not going to be able to get out of there before the train hits him. And so Umar finally comes to a stop and he watches as this man down on the tracks lets go of the lip of this platform and just turns and faces the train like he knows what's about to happen. And then seconds later, the train, although it did try to stop, impacted this man and killed him instantly. The man's name was Kaisa Khan, and he was 58 years old. When the police finally showed up, they arrested the other man who Han had been fighting with. He was a 30-year-old named Naeem Davis, and Davis would actually tell police that he had been fighting with Han and he had pushed him onto the tracks, but it was in self-defense. However, that self-defense story didn't stop him from being charged with murder. While Davis sat in jail waiting for his trial, the media and the public at large had already come to the conclusion that Davis was guilty. And this was due in large part to a particular picture. As Umar was running down the platform, holding up his camera, holding the flash down, trying to flag the train conductor to get him to stop, Umar was also taking dozens and dozens of pictures. And those pictures were of Han right before he was struck by the train. And so after Umar ultimately discovered he had taken these pictures, he gave them to his employer, the New York Post newspaper, and the day after the incident, they ran on the front page a picture of Han right before he's about to be killed with the headline, "Doomed." And so once the public saw this picture, nobody could believe that Davis was anything other than a cold-blooded killer for pushing this poor innocent man onto the tracks. But as it would turn out, nearly 5 years later, when Davis did finally get his trial, he was acquitted of all charges because it turned out Hahn was very drunk and had picked a fight with Davis, and Davis was filmed on more than one occasion on the platform trying to get Hahn to leave him alone. And so finally, after Hahn began making death threats and then grabbed Davis's shoulder, Davis turned around and pushed him, and Hahn, being drunk, stumbled and fell backwards onto the tracks and then was ultimately killed. Here is the infamous photo of Hahn on the cover of the New York Post newspaper. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please become a surgeon and get a job at the hospital located nearest to where the like button lives. And then eventually, when the like button goes in for a very minor outpatient surgery, accidentally give them a craniectomy. In 2009, Rebecca Aylward was a 14-year-old girl living near Bridgend, Wales. She was very close with her mother and her younger siblings. She was a model student, and she was well liked amongst her peers. That year, she began spending more and more time with a boy in her grade, 14-year-old Josh Davies, who, like her, was a model student and had many friends. In October of that year, Rebecca's mother asked her if Josh was her boyfriend, and she said yes. Even though she knew her daughter was a bit young to be in a serious relationship, she had spent enough time around Josh to form a very high opinion of him. He was incredibly kind and generous and protective of Rebecca, and so she was happy for the two of them. In January of the following year, Josh was allowed to stay over for the weekend at Rebecca's house, and Rebecca's mother remembers the two of them having such a good time together, goofing around with Rebecca's younger siblings and painting each other's nails. When Josh left at the end of that weekend, he told Rebecca that it had been the best weekend of his life. After he left, Rebecca couldn't stop smiling. She was in love. But later that day, Rebecca received a very surprising text message from Josh. He told her he didn't want to be in a relationship with her anymore. Rebecca was crushed, and she tried to get an answer out of Josh as to why he wanted to break it off, but he didn't give her one, and instead he began spreading horrible rumors about her at school, and then he went around to all of her friends and told them what a horrible person she was. And so for the rest of that school year, that's how it went. Josh just continued to mercilessly bully Rebecca for no reason. And then behind closed doors, Josh would tell his friends that he not only hated Rebecca, that he wanted to kill Rebecca. But none of his friends took it seriously. In fact, one of his friends even told Josh that if he ever killed Rebecca, he would buy him breakfast. Fast forward to the end of 2010, when the next school year began, and Josh's behavior completely changed. Suddenly, he was being nice and caring to Rebecca and showing a genuine interest in her. And Rebecca, even though this guy had abused her for the past better part of a year, she secretly still loved him, and so before long, she allowed him back into her life. About a month later, on the evening of October 22nd, Josh sent Rebecca a Facebook message asking her if she would meet him the following day in the woods near their home. This was a popular hangout spot for teens, and so to Rebecca, this constituted a date. This would be the first official date since their breakup nearly a year ago, and so Rebecca was excited and told him, sure, I'd love to go. And so the next day, Rebecca got up early to put on her makeup and to get ready and get dressed, and then after she was all dolled up, she said bye to her mom and she headed out to meet up with Josh. Shortly after she left, Rebecca's mom got a bad feeling about this meetup, and so she called her daughter and said, hey, stay on the phone with me until you see Josh. And so the two of them chatted until Rebecca made her way to the edge of the woods, and then she says to her mom, oh, I can see Josh, he's walking towards me, everything is totally fine, I love you and I'll see you later. After she hung up the phone, Joshua walked up to her, said hello, took her hand, and then walked her back into the woods. That morning, Josh had changed his profile picture on Facebook to be an image of the woods where they were having this meeting. And then also that morning, Josh had texted one of his friends and said, you'll be owing me that breakfast soon. And so Josh led Rebecca for quite a while deep into the woods until he came to a stop. And while they were stopped, Rebecca at some point turned to look at something, and with her back to Josh, Josh reached down, grabbed a very heavy rock, and proceeded to beat her to death. Afterwards, Josh called his friends to see what they were up to, and they asked him if he was still with Rebecca. And so Josh is standing over this poor girl's lifeless body, and he says to them, Define with. Later that day, Josh brought his best friend into the woods and showed him Rebecca's body. And then less than 24 hours later, that friend would tell police what Josh had done. During Josh's trial, he was completely unfazed, completely emotionless, and was seen smiling for much of it. He said he didn't kill Rebecca, and in fact, he tried to place the blame on his best friend, but the jury saw through it, they found him guilty, and he was ultimately sentenced to 14 years in prison. To this day, no one knows for sure why Josh killed Rebecca. The only concrete motive anybody can point to is that one of Josh's friends offered him breakfast if he went through with the killing. Here is a photo of Josh with Rebecca shortly before he killed her. At the start of World War II in 1939, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia did its best to stay neutral and out of the war. But on March 25th, 1941, they finally caved to Nazi pressure and signed a treaty that aligned them with the Nazis. 2 days later, Yugoslavian military leaders who were unhappy with this treaty overthrew their government and installed a new king in hopes he would be able to keep their country out of the war. But upon learning of this coup, Hitler issued a directive that classified this new Yugoslavian government as hostile and ordered its invasion. 10 days later, on April 6th, the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia, and then 11 days after that, Yugoslavia surrendered. But despite their speedy victory, the Nazis struggled to maintain control of the country because of local resistance groups that fought them at every turn. One of the primary resistance groups was called the Partisans. 3 months after the Nazis' invasion, a 15-year-old girl named Lipa Radic and her family, who all lived in Yugoslavia, were arrested by the Nazis. 3 of the men in Lipa's family were members of the Partisans and so had attracted Nazi attention. 20 days later, as the family still sat in jail wondering what the Nazis were going to do to them, undercover partisans broke into the prison and freed them. After getting back home, Lipa, who was totally inspired by the bravery of these partisan warriors, she immediately joined their group. As a partisan, Lipa would serve as a nurse on the front lines, treating and evacuating the wounded, and then at night she would participate in direct combat against the Nazis. By 1943, when Lipa was just 17 years old, she had become a very hardened warrior. In February of that year, Lipa was leading a rescue effort of all these women and children, and she was walking them up a mountainside to a partisan camp when the Nazis came out of nowhere and surrounded them on all 4 sides. And Lipa, who refused to surrender, expended all of her ammunition defending these women and children until she was eventually captured. The Nazis moved Lipa to a nearby village where they viciously interrogated her, demanding that she give up the names and locations of her partisan comrades, but Lipa refused. After 3 more days of unsuccessfully trying to get Lipa to give up information, the Nazis grew frustrated and sentenced her to death. And so later that day, Lipa was marched out to a tree situated next to a train station, and hanging down from one of the branches was a noose, and under the noose was a table. With her hands tied behind her back and only wool socks on her feet, the 17-year-old girl calmly climbed up onto the table and stared down at the crowd. As the noose was being tied around her neck, the Nazi commander gave Lipa one more chance to give up information about her partisan comrades, and if she did that, they would spare her life. The Nazis had brought out a cameraman to document this execution because their plan was they would distribute the pictures all over the country to scare the partisans into submission, that this is what happens if we catch partisans. And so with the cameras flashing away, Lipa famously turned to face this Nazi commander and glared at him and said, "Those who you're asking about will reveal themselves when they wipe out all of you evildoers to the last man." After this, Lipa was hanged. The pictures of her execution were indeed distributed all around the country, but there was no context or story. It was just some partisan being executed by the Nazis. But eventually, Lipa's story about her defiance and her famous last words found their way into the partisan camp, and suddenly those images of her execution took on brand new meaning. They no longer inspired fear like the Nazis were hoping. They inspired courage and pride and a will to keep fighting. When the Nazis discovered this is what that picture now represented, they tried to destroy all of these pictures, but it was too late. Lipa had already become a national hero. Following her death, the partisans continued to fight the Nazis and eventually helped to defeat them. After the war was over, the partisans were recognized as one of the most effective guerrilla forces in the entire war. On December 20th, 1951, Lipa was posthumously awarded the second highest military award in Yugoslavia, called the Order of the National Hero. Here is the photo of Lipa glaring at that Nazi commander after she's just told him her comrades are going to kill him. In 2017, Steven Weber was a larger-than-life 38-year-old DJ living in Louisiana. That year, through a mutual friend, he met Kenesha Antoine, who was a 38-year-old lawyer also living in Louisiana. And as soon as they met, they immediately hit it off and began dating. They both had always wanted to travel the world, but they never got around to it because life always seemed to get in the way. But now that they had each other, and so therefore had travel partners, they decided they couldn't wait any longer, and so they created a bucket list of all the places in the world they wanted to go. And then over the next couple of years, they began checking places off their list. In 2019, when Kenesha was going to turn 40, they decided they needed to go somewhere really special to celebrate. And so they checked their bucket list to see where they hadn't gone yet, and they ultimately settled on going to East Africa because there was a resort there they had always wanted to stay in. It was called the Pemba Resort, and it was famous for their underwater room. They literally have a 2-story cabin floating 300 meters off the coast. Its main floor is at surface level. It's got a beautiful couch that looks out over the water, and you can take the stairs up to the roof of the main floor where there's another couch and you can stargaze and look out 360 degrees, and there's no other cabins out on the water. You're completely isolated. And then if you go back down to the main floor, there is a ladder that goes straight down 10 meters into the master bedroom, and it's completely underwater. All 4 walls have these huge windows that look out directly into the beautiful Indian Ocean. To stay in this cabin for one night costs $1,700, and so Steven and Kenesha decided they would only splurge on it for one night at the end of their Africa trip. So in September of that year, the couple flew out to Africa, and for over a week, they enjoyed sightseeing and going on safaris and eating nice food, and then at the end of their trip, it was time to head out to the underwater room. So they got to the Pemba Resort on the mainland, they checked in, and then they loaded into a boat and were brought out 300 meters to their actual cabin out on the water. And then after the boat left them there, Kenesha got out her phone and began filming. And she filmed as the two walked around and they looked at the amazing view. They went onto the roof and they're looking all around and they're laughing because it's so unbelievably beautiful. And then at some point they make their way down that ladder down into the master bedroom underwater. And the two just can't stop laughing because it was so bizarre and just so incredible being down there. There were fish that were coming up to the glass and just staring at them. They just couldn't believe what they were seeing. And then at some point Steven makes a joke that a shark was coming, and Kenesha turns around and then sarcastically laughs at him and says, "Oh, okay, haha, yeah, a shark," and then she turns off the recording. A little while later, Steven leaves Kenesha in the master bedroom and he goes upstairs and he puts on fins and then hops in the water. Kenesha, who's still down in the master bedroom, is surprised when she sees her boyfriend on the other side of the glass out in the Indian Ocean. And so Kenesha just grabs her phone and starts filming him because she knows he's up to something. And then at some point, Steven pulls out a plastic bag with a handwritten note inside of it, and he presses it up against the glass so she can see what it says. And so Kenesha zooms in on the note, and you can tell from the tone in her voice, she really doesn't know what he's doing, but then there's a pause in the video as she's reading the note. And the note says, "I can't hold my breath long enough to tell you everything I love about you, but everything I love about you, I love more and more every day. Will you please be my wife? Marry me." Kenesha is so astounded at this proposal. You can tell she's almost crying. She's so excited. And so as she just continues to film him, Steven pulls out a ring and he holds it up to the glass. And now at this point, Kenesha is just beside herself. She couldn't be happier. And so Steven closes the ring box, he grabs the letter, and he swims up out of view back to the surface. And Kenesha turns off the recording, turns around, runs to the ladder, and climbs up to the main floor to give Steven her answer that yes, she would marry him. But when she got up there, she looked around and Steven wasn't up there. And so she's yelling for him, she's looking around, waiting for him to show up, but he's not. And so she runs up onto the roof of the main structure to get a better look around to see where he went. But when she got up there, she looked down and there's nothing but ocean. There's no sign of Steven anywhere. And so starting to panic, she runs back down to the main floor at surface level, and now she's frantically yelling for Steven, yelling for him to come up to the surface. Where is he? Where are you? But there's no response. Kenesha is all alone out in this cabin in the middle of the ocean. She has no way to contact anyone on the mainland, and so she has no idea what to do. She doesn't know if she should just jump in the water to go looking for him. She doesn't know if he's maybe playing a joke on her. She just doesn't know what's happening. And so she just reflexively begins screaming out for help, hoping that somebody will hear her and come help her find Stephen. And after a little while, some boaters not too far away hear her yelling out for help. They come over and they, along with Kenesha, begin looking, and they ultimately find Stephen. But by the time they found him, it was too late. He had drowned. The details of exactly how he managed to drown or exactly where he was when they found him are not listed online. Here are the final photos of Stephen Weber. On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers successfully flew the world's first motor-operated airplane. By 1910, airplanes had improved to the point where they were considered a reasonable form of travel, and so people began focusing on how to make them safer. One big safety concern with airplanes at the time was there was no parachute small enough or light enough to be taken on board with passengers. And so if the plane malfunctioned and was crashing, everybody had to go down with it. So in 1911, a prominent French aviation club offered a large sum of money to anybody who could design a parachute for airplane passengers. A man named Franz Reichelt, who was a tailor in Paris, but who had always had a fascination with aviation, saw this reward in the paper and decided to take on this challenge. The design he came up with was not an external device like a backpack. Instead, it was a full suit with foldable bat wings that attached to the passenger's arms and connected all the way down to their ankles. Using his sewing know-how, he stitched up this totally bizarre looking prototype, and he attached it to a dummy and threw it off of his apartment building. And amazingly, the dummy landed lightly on the ground. But when Franz, who significantly outweighed this dummy, put on his parachute suit and leapt off of the building himself, he did not touch the ground lightly. He smashed into the ground and broke his leg. But Franz was undeterred. He made dozens of changes to his suit, he added material, he subtracted material, and after a while, he felt like it was ready to be submitted to this French aviation club. But when the club members watched one of Franz's dummies wearing the suit come crashing into the ground because the canopy collapsed, they rejected his design. Franz assured them his design could work, they just needed to see it in action from a slightly higher altitude. The canopy needed more time to fully inflate. But the club members were not buying it, and they told Franz he should just give up on the design. Franz was offended and decided he would prove them wrong. So in 1911, Franz began petitioning to the city of Paris to allow him to test his design off of the Eiffel Tower. He thought if he jumped from one of their platforms, that would be high enough for his canopy to fully inflate, thereby showing that his design really did work. And so for a year, the city of Paris repeatedly rejected Franz every time he asked for the chance to do this. But in 1912, something changed and the city said, okay, you know what, Franz? You can test your parachute on the Eiffel Tower. But what the city didn't know, because Franz had intentionally kept it secret from them, was he didn't intend to launch a dummy off of the Eiffel Tower wearing his suit. He was going to put the parachute suit on and jump off these 17 stories himself. And so on February 4th of that year, Franz arrived at the tower, and standing around the base of it was a throng of people and journalists who had all read about this experiment in the newspaper. And so when Franz got out and promptly put on his parachute suit, the crowd gasped. They couldn't believe he was going to be the one jumping off of the tower. And none of Franz's friends or family knew he was going to be jumping off the tower himself. And so they pleaded with him not to do this. Throw a dummy off. You should not be jumping off. This is not going to work. Legend has it, Franz turned to one of his friends and he said, "You will see that my 72 kilos and my parachute will give your arguments the most decisive of denials." Then Franz promptly turned around and began walking up the stairs towards the platform, and with him was a journalist who brought a camera. Once Franz reached the platform, the journalist began filming him, and his video would capture Franz climbing up onto the railing and then hesitating, and he anxiously begins kind of rocking back and forth like he's debating whether he's really going to do this, and then at some point he works up the courage and he jumps, and immediately his suit collapses and he slams into the ground, dying instantly. Another cameraman was on the ground and he filmed Franz's final jump. Here is a still shot of Franz right before impact. 45-year-old Florida man Mike Moylan suddenly shot up in bed and grabbed the sides of his head, wincing in pain. He had a blinding headache. He squinted across the room at the alarm clock. It was 4:30 in the morning on June 28, 2007. Mike got out of bed and tried to stand up, but he immediately got dizzy, so he sat back down again, took a couple of deep breaths, and then he stood up again, and this time he was steady on his feet. He walked across his bedroom into his bathroom where he opened the medicine cabinet, grabbed some painkillers, swallowed 3 of them, and then walked back into his bedroom. Before he lay down, down again, he noticed there was a dark spot on his pillow. Now, it was dark in his room, so he couldn't really tell what it was, and his wife April was fast asleep in bed with him, so he didn't want to flip the lights on and wake her up, but he had a feeling that that spot was likely blood. And so he ran his hands all over his head to see if there was blood coming off of him, and he found some on his right ear. And so he thought to himself, well, I guess my wife must have elbowed me in my sleep. That's why I'm bleeding, and that's why my head hurts. And so feeling content that that was what happened, he laid back down and waited for the meds to kick in so he could sleep. But after 30 minutes of complete restlessness, not only had the meds done nothing, it seemed like his headache was getting progressively worse and his ear continued to bleed. And suddenly Mike thought to himself, wait a minute, what if I have an aneurysm that's burst, and that's why there's blood leaking out of my ear onto the pillow? A brain aneurysm is the bulging or ballooning of a blood vessel in the brain, and if it ruptures, it can be fatal. And so now, feeling scared that he was dying, Mike woke up his wife April and told her we gotta go to the hospital right away. And April, who's half asleep, seemed very confused, but eventually got the message, and they got up, they hopped in her car, and she drove them to the emergency room. As soon as they got there, doctors x-rayed Mike's head. Afterwards, when Mike and April were sitting in an exam room, a nurse walked in holding onto an x-ray image, and she held it up to the light and she pointed to a foreign object in Mike's skull, and she says, well, it looks like you got shot. Mike couldn't believe it, and neither could the nurse or any of the doctors. He should have been dead. April, who was apparently so overcome with emotions, ran out of the room, and Mike was quickly ushered into emergency surgery, where after a couple of hours, they were able to remove the bullet from his head. As Mike lay in his hospital bed recovering from the surgery with his wife next to him, the police showed up and began asking questions about what happened. And they initially just believed that a stray bullet must have entered the home and struck Mike in the side of his head. But after speaking to the couple, April revealed that she slept with a pistol underneath her pillow and that maybe it had fired accidentally. And then when they really dug into this and they asked her more questions about this gun underneath her pillow, her story began to unravel, and eventually she would confess that she had in fact tried to kill Mike and shot him while he was sleeping. She told police the reason she did it is she had recently destroyed one of the couple's successful businesses, but Mike had not found out about it yet. And so she decided she would kill him before he could find out. After her confession, Mike was crushed and felt like an idiot, but he would tell police that there were a couple of red flags about his wife that he noticed on the night he actually woke up with this headache. For one, when he told her, hey, I want to go to the hospital because I'm bleeding out of my ear, she apparently took a really long time getting dressed and acted overly confused about what was happening, well beyond the I'm just tired routine. And then when they got in the car and were driving to the hospital, she was driving impossibly slow and he was asking her to speed up and she just wouldn't. And so Mike realized now that what she was really doing was hoping if she just delayed long enough, he might die before they reached the hospital. Obviously, he did not. April was jailed on attempted murder charges, but just a year after being in prison, she was released on a plea deal. Here is the image of Mike's x-ray where they discovered he had a bullet in his head. One of the most insane jobs in the world is being a saturation diver for an oil and gas company. These highly specialized divers go down to extreme depths to do construction and demolition on underwater structures. The extreme pressure on their bodies from being so deep will cause some of the mixed gas they breathe to get trapped inside of their body. Now, this is harmless while it's happening, so while they're down at depth, this doesn't matter. But when they ascend, they have to do what's called decompression stops, where they basically stop in the water column at certain depths and just wait and allow these trapped gases to naturally come out of their body. Now, if they skip these decompression stops and just rush to the surface, those trapped gases will not leave their body and they will expand inside of them, causing a condition called decompression sickness or the bends, and it can be fatal. Now, these decompression stops get longer and longer the deeper you go, and in the case of saturation divers, they'll go as deep as 2,000 feet. And for reference, in order to safely ascend from 2,000 feet, it would take you about 33 hours. And so these oil and gas companies can't afford to have their divers taking 33 hours in between dives, and so they came up with a clever workaround. They built a pressurized chamber system on board ships and oil rigs where their divers would live in between their dives. And what this did was, by keeping their divers constantly under pressure, either literally underwater or in this system, the trapped gases inside of them didn't have a chance to expand, and so their divers couldn't get the bends. The divers would live inside of this incredibly cramped chamber for weeks at a time, getting transported to and from the sea floor inside of this small pressurized sphere that's called a dive bell, bell that could detach from the chamber without totally depressurizing the whole system. At the end of these divers' multi-week shifts, they would do one long decompression stop inside of the chamber. And then when they were done, they'd step out of the chamber and they'd be fine again. In September of 2012, a 32-year-old saturation diver named Chris Lemons was on board a dive ship in the middle of the North Sea. He, along with 11 other divers, had just started a 4-week-long saturation shift. On the 12th of that month, Chris, along with 2 other divers named Dave and Duncan, were scheduled to perform routine maintenance on an oil platform 330 feet below the surface. The North Sea is notorious for terrible weather, but this day the weather was especially bad, and they considered not doing the dive, but ultimately they decided to do it anyways. As Chris, Dave, and Duncan put on their diving equipment and climbed from their living chamber through the tunnel into the dive bell, the captain of the ship navigated directly over this oil platform and then flipped on autopilot mode, which activated dynamic positioning. Now, dive ships rely heavily on dynamic positioning, which is really just this high-tech computer that makes sure as soon as you turn it on that the ship does not move from a particular spot in the water. So regardless of the swells and the wind, the ship stays steady. And this is really important when you have divers in the water because the dive bell is connected to the ship and the divers are connected to the dive bell. And so if the ship is moving all over the place, so is the dive bell, and so are the divers, making it impossible for the divers to do their job. Once the captain had the dynamic positioning up and running, the 3 divers sealed the door of the dive bell behind them, and then the dive bell was detached from the chamber and then lowered through a hole in the middle of the ship into the ocean. Once the bell got down to 330 feet, Chris opened up a hatch on the bottom of the dive bell that led directly into the water. Now, because the pressure inside the bell matches the pressure outside the bell, water does not come in through this hole. Duncan was the bellman for the night, so he would not be going out and doing any diving. He would be staying in the bell to support Dave and Chris. And so he helped them get their big helmets on and connected their umbilical to each of them. Sat divers, when they're outside of the bell, are completely reliant on their umbilical. It's this long stretch of tubes and wires that are connected directly to their suit and to their helmet, and it provides air as well as heat and electricity to their lights, and it provides radio communication up to the people on the boat. Once Chris and Dave were all set up, they slipped through the hole at the bottom of the bell, which brought them down to this little platform that was suspended right below the bell, and from there they leapt off all the way down to the sea floor. Now, sat divers will say that leap from that platform is both amazing and terrifying, because once you leave the bell, it's completely pitch black all around you, so there's no reference point of how fast you're going or even how close to the ground you are. And so it feels like you're just sinking into this endless abyss before you crash into the ground. Once Chris and Dave did hit the ground, they stood up and began walking, and they were directed by the radio in their helmet which direction they needed to go to reach this oil platform. The oil platform was 11 meters tall, and it looked like a sort of pyramid of these big steel pipes. They climbed up the side until they reached their respective working area, and then they settled in to do their job, which they expected to take about 6 hours. At first, everything was going to plan, but about an hour into the job, something went terribly wrong on the surface. The dynamic positioning computer failed. Now, the captain immediately saw it and just expected the backup computer to kick in and take over. But in a terrible turn of luck, the backup computer also failed. And so very quickly, this huge dive ship began drifting in the rough seas, dragging with it the dive bell and the divers 330 feet below. While the captain struggled to try to fix the system and get it back online and get the ship back on station, another crew member hopped on the radio and called down to Dave and Chris, who were outside of the dive bell, and told them to abandon the structure and get back in the bell ASAP. And Chris and Dave could tell from the urgency in this person's voice that this was no drill, this was serious. Chris and Dave were both positioned on the south side of the structure about halfway up, and their umbilicals were running straight up the structure and then northward because the ship was drifting northward. So neither Chris nor Dave could go around the structure. They needed to go straight up before being able to climb their umbilicals back up to the bell. And so both men began climbing, but they could feel the tension on their umbilical was getting tighter and tighter, and Dave managed to get all the way to the top, and he cleared the lip, and as soon as he was on top, he started getting pulled away from the structure. And he looked to see if Chris was also getting pulled, and all he saw was Chris's umbilical, impossibly stretched, still draped over the south side, and he could not see Chris. And that's when Dave, Duncan, and all the people on the surface heard Chris come over the radio frantically saying he was stuck on the underwater structure. His umbilical had gotten wrapped around one of the pylons. And so through the radio, Chris asked Duncan to give him more slack. But Duncan said, "There is no more slack. We are completely tight here. You have to get it free. And Chris would say, I can't unfree it. It keeps getting tighter and tighter. I can't get it off the pylon. And so Dave jumped down onto the platform and tried to pull himself over to Chris, but his own umbilical was getting pulled towards the dive bell, and so he could not help Chris. And so Dave knew he couldn't do anything, so he turned and began crawling up his umbilical towards the dive bell, and as he's climbing, he hears behind him this extremely loud explosion. It sounded like a shotgun going off, and what it was Chris's umbilical snapping under the tension. As soon as the umbilical snapped, it sent Chris flying backwards off the structure, falling towards the ocean floor. Without his umbilical, he wouldn't have had light, he wouldn't have had a radio to talk to anybody up on the boat, he wouldn't have had heat, and the water was just barely above freezing, and so he would have been very cold very fast, and he would not have had an air supply. Although he would have had 2 backup canisters on his back that would automatically turn on. However, they only gave him 5 or maybe 6 minutes of air. And so when Chris hit the ocean floor, it would have been eerily quiet and completely pitch black. He stood up at some point and looked around him and didn't see anything, but knew he had to get back to the underwater structure. It was his only chance of anybody finding him again. And so he had to make the impossible decision of just choosing a direction and blindly walking, not having any idea what you're walking towards. Choose wrong and you might walk over a cliff. But at some point, Chris made up his mind and just began walking in a single direction, and miraculously, he walked into the underwater structure. He climbed up the side until he got to the top, which was a flat metal grate, and there he looked around and saw there was no dive bell, there was no sign of anything. It was just him. He was completely all alone. And he must have known at this point that he was running out of air. He probably had maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. And so he would have been acutely aware that even if they're looking for him, they're not going to find him in time. He's going to die. And at some point, breathing would have become extremely difficult until there was no more air, and then he would have passed out and keeled over. Back on the surface, the captain was desperately trying to use manual controls to pilot the ship back over where Chris was, but because of how rough the seas were, it was proving to be nearly impossible. As the captain struggled, other members of the crew launched a remote-controlled vehicle into the water to at least go down and try to find Chris. And so they decided they would just pilot straight to the underwater structure and begin looking around that area. And so for a few anxious minutes, the crew on board the ship watched the camera, which was the live feed coming from this underwater vehicle, as it went through totally dark water. And then at some point on the screen, the structure just appeared, and the vehicle, as it went up towards the top, it got a look at the very top of the structure. And on the screen, they saw Chris lying on his side, totally motionless. At this point, he had been without air for at least 20 minutes. In a last-ditch effort, the captain decided to completely power off the ship and its computer and just do a hard reset, something that you would never do, especially in rough seas, because if it doesn't come back on again, you are dead in the water. But when they turned it back on again, the ship came on and the computer system came back online, including the dynamic positioning computer. And so the captain immediately threw it on autopilot and the ship navigated right over where Chris's last position was. After Chris's umbilical had broken, Dave had managed to climb back up to the bell, and he was just standing underneath that platform right beneath it. And so when the ship got right back over Chris's position, Dave leapt off the platform, got to the seafloor, climbed up the structure, grabbed hold of Chris's body, and hauled him back up into the bell. Once Chris's body was inside the bell, Duncan, the bellman, removed Chris's helmet, and he saw that his face was blue and he was totally lifeless. But Duncan immediately just gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And after giving him 2 big breaths, Chris came back to life. He started gagging and coughing, and he's looking around wide-eyed, and Duncan and Dave are looking at him like, you gotta be kidding me, you're supposed to be dead. And after about 30 seconds, the color in Chris's face had totally come back, and he was looking at Duncan and Dave and asked them, what happened? And Duncan and Dave didn't have an answer for him. And so instead, all 3 men just started laughing and hugging. They could not believe it. Once Chris was brought back up to the ship, the dive medic looked at him and concluded that nothing was wrong with him. He was perfectly fine, despite the fact he had been without an air supply for over 30 minutes. And 3 weeks after the incident, Chris was back down saturation diving again. Today, scientists don't know how Chris survived. The leading theory is that it was just so cold, it slowed his heart and his brain down, and that somehow kept him alive. But the reality is, his survival is a total mystery. Here is what the crew saw when their remote-controlled vehicle found Chris lying on top of that platform. Today, we're going to look at 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the photo that is famously associated with them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please build the like button's confidence way up and tell them to run for student body president. Help them hand out flyers, help them with their speech, and then when the big day comes, don't vote for them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. There are 3 waterfalls spanning the Canadian-USA border that combined make up the famous Niagara Falls. They have a max height of about 170 feet at their highest point, and every second, 700,000 gallons of water tumbles over the edge. The rapids above the falls are some of the strongest and most violent in the world, with a max speed of about 40 miles per hour right before you hit the edge. As a result, no one's allowed to boat or swim in the final 3.2 miles of the Niagara River that feeds into the falls. But back in the day, there was no such restriction. On the evening of July 16th, 1853, 3 men were working on a small barge anchored in the Niagara River about a half-mile away from the edge of the falls. Once they were done with work, the way they would get back to shore is by taking a rowboat and taking it downstream to this small island called Goat Island that sits right on the edge of the falls. Now, in order to get to that island, you would have to traverse the rapids. But it was only a couple hundred feet away, and because they worked here all the time, they had traversed the rapids many times before without incident. But this time, as soon as they got in, one of their oars broke. And so they weren't able to control their boat, and very quickly they got dragged into the rapids, started getting spun around, and then it capsized. Although they desperately tried to swim to shore, the rapids were just too strong, and 2 of the men were swept away to their death. But one man, Joseph Avery, was lucky enough that when he fell in, he drifted down and grabbed onto this tree root that was sticking out of the water. And so he pulled himself about halfway up out of the water, he caught his breath, and he's looking around, and he can't believe he survived. But he wasn't out of the water yet, so to speak, because he was in the middle of these rapids and there was nobody on shore. It was getting late. His 2 buddies have drowned, and when he yelled out, the rapids were so loud nobody could hear him. And the log he was holding on to was totally slick, and so he had to grip it as hard as he could, otherwise he would just slip back into the water. And so all night, with half of his body in the water, he gripped onto this branch as tight as he could and just prayed he would survive. The next morning, when tourists arrived, they noticed Joseph out on this log and they waved to him, and Joseph, who had used all his strength just to hold onto this log all night, was not only fatigued, but also was becoming hypothermic, and he very carefully removed one hand and he waved back. The tourists immediately notified authorities and a rescue effort was launched. And because it was too dangerous to take a boat and try to drive down to Avery and pull him out that way because he was right near the edge of the falls, what they did is they went up to this little bridge that was upstream of Joseph and they released rafts and small boats, hoping that one of them, just by chance, would get caught up on that log and he could grab it, and then Joseph could climb in, throw the rope out, and get pulled to shore. But unfortunately, after dozens of attempts, nothing came close to Joseph. Their next plan was to tie a long tether onto one boat and then guide it down the river until it reached Joseph, and this worked. But when Joseph climbed into the boat, it immediately began to capsize, and witnesses would say Joseph stood up, and as he was falling backwards, he threw his hands up in the air like he was surrendering. He let out a final scream and then fell under the turbulent waters, and then seconds later he was swept off the falls to his death. Here is the final photo of Joseph Avery. It was taken by a journalist right before that boat with a tether attached to it arrived in front of him. Chad Lawhorn woke up in his Nashville home around 3 a.m. on April 8th, 2018. He had taken a long flight back from San Francisco the night before, so his sleep schedule was all messed up. Not feeling very tired, he decided to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a snack. And as he was walking down the stairs, he pulled out his phone and he saw a notification from his Venmo account. His younger brother, Casey, had sent him $250, and attached to it was a single word note. It just said, "damages." Knowing his brother had long struggled with his mental health, Chad was concerned he was getting ready to hurt himself, and he had sent him this money as a way to compensate for the emotional toll he was about to inflict on him. Chad didn't even change out of his pajamas. He grabbed his keys, hopped in his car, and began driving the 2 hours to East Ridge, Tennessee, where his younger brother and his mother lived. On the ride there, he called both of them dozens of times, but he never got through. When he finally pulled onto their street, he looked down the road and he saw dozens of police cars and TV crews, and there was yellow crime scene tape all around their property. Chad just stopped the car right in the middle of the road and just stared. And he didn't know how long he was there for, but at some point one of the police officers noticed him and walked up and knocked on his window. And when the officer found out who he was talking to, the news Chad was delivered was far worse than anything he was expecting. 24 hours earlier, Chad's younger brother, Casey, who was 23, was spending the day with one of his very good friends named Avery. They had gone to a comic book store to play Magic the Gathering, and then afterwards they headed back to Casey's house to go to bed. Around 12:30 in the morning, Avery fell asleep on the living room floor, and as Casey was getting ready to go to bed himself, his mother called him and asked if he could come pick her up at the bar. And so Casey begrudgingly agreed to do it. He drove to pick her up, and when he saw her, he could tell she was totally intoxicated, and the entire ride home, she just pleaded with Casey not to hurt himself because it would totally devastate her if he ever did that. Casey hated when she talked to him that way, and apparently she did this all the time. When they got back to the house, Casey dropped his mom off, and then he went up to his bedroom where he retrieved a rifle he had stolen from a friend. And then he paced around his room for a while, getting mentally prepared for what he was about to do. And when he felt ready, he left his room, he went downstairs to the living room where Avery was still asleep on the ground, and he placed the rifle up against the side of his head, and he fired one shot, killing his friend instantly. Once he was dead, Casey went upstairs to his mother's room. When he got to the threshold of her room, he pushed the door open and it was totally dark, but he could tell his mother was still awake in her bed. He raised his rifle and he fired, except the gun didn't go off. It jammed. His mother, because she was so intoxicated, did not hear the shot ring out, and she didn't really know what her son was doing in the doorway, so she did not raise any alarms. And so Casey just turned around, walked into the hallway where there was light, he fixed the jam in his gun, he turned back around, and this time his mother was now out of bed because the family dog was barking like mad, and so his mother was trying to calm the dog down, and she looked up and saw her son standing in the doorway carrying a gun, and so she just kind of froze and stared at him, and that's when Casey, without any hesitation, raises his rifle and fires 2 shots, and then his gun jams again. Now, neither of those 2 shots were fatal, although one of them did strike her in the arm. And even though she was intoxicated, she was now fully aware her son is trying to kill her. And so she's screaming at him, "Why are you doing this? You're killing me!" Casey was totally unfazed. He flipped on the lights, he fixed the jam, he re-aimed at his mother, and his mother, who was still just standing next to the bed, looking at her son, wondering why this was happening, and Casey just aimed and took 2 shots, and these would be fatal. After that, he went downstairs and robbed Avery, and then he hopped in his car and he drove all the way to Mississippi, where within 24 hours, he would take his own life. We know all of these details because shortly after he committed these crimes, Casey posted a lengthy confession to Facebook detailing exactly what happened and what he did. This is a screenshot of the actual post. It's extremely graphic and it's since been removed from the social media platform. In his post, Casey says he feels extremely bad for his older brother Chad because he knows this is going to be extremely hard for him, and he encourages people to help his brother during this insanely difficult time. While he doesn't provide a specific motive for why he committed these crimes, he does say at the end of his confession that he's been thinking about murder a lot lately and wanted to know how it felt. But after doing it, he says he barely felt anything at all. In 1996, 28-year-old Paljor Tawang was offered the opportunity of a lifetime. Born and raised in a valley at the foot of the Himalayas, he was chosen to lead the first ever Indian ascent of the north face of the highest peak in the world, Mount Everest. He had left school after the 10th grade and joined the highly competitive and prestigious Indo-Tibetan Border Police. Created in 1962 in response to their domineering neighbor, China, the Border Police specialized in high-altitude landscapes. They had to, given that the boundary between India and China ran through the very rugged Himalayan mountain range. 12 years after joining the Border Police, Paljor was an expert climber and very well liked by his peers, making him an obvious candidate for one of the Border Police's most ambitious missions to date. While Paljor's mother was full of pride for her son's work and accomplishments, he didn't think she would be very supportive if she knew how dangerous the mission he was going on was. And so he told her he was climbing a different mountain, although she would find out through friends where he was actually going, and she would plead with him not to go, but Paljor was not about to change his mind. He was excited and he was confident. In May of that year, Paljor said bye to his family, and he and the other hikers set out on their journey. At first, it went extremely well. The weather was perfect, and the men seemed to be having an excellent time. but their luck would not hold. The team's final assault on the north face of Mount Everest was marked by mistakes, bad decisions, and very bad weather. According to the official report on the ascent, those problems started on the morning of May 10th when Paljor and the other 3 climbers woke up late. Instead of leaving base camp at 3:30 a.m. like they were planning to, they didn't leave until 8 a.m., so 4.5 hours late. Making matters worse, the weather continued to deteriorate with a blizzard moving in, creating near zero visibility. But even under the best of circumstances, Mount Everest is still a force of nature. The summit may be covered in colorful ropes and flags and climbers with their high-tech, shiny, beautiful gear, accompanied by a small army of Sherpas, but the outward appearance of commercialization is deceptive. Since 1924, at least 300 people have died on Mount Everest. The death-to-summit ratio is a staggering 4%. The extremely high altitude Everest reaches 5.5 miles into the sky not only makes physical exertion extremely difficult, it affects your judgment and decision-making, and not in a good way. Climbers and scientists have a name for the final half mile of Mount Everest. It's called the death zone because literally, while you're up there, you're dying. Oxygen is so limited up there that your cells just begin to die, and extremely fit people will have heart attacks and strokes and experience debilitating altitude sickness. The conditions are so severe that people have died from exhaustion just standing in line waiting to reach the summit. But one of the biggest killers in the death zone is something called summit fever. When you get to that point in the climb, you are so close to reaching your goal. People will disregard safety and keep going on when really they should turn around and go back. Paljor and his 3 teammates were given strict orders to turn around at 3 p.m. if they had not reached the summit yet. But because of their late start, when 3 p.m. rolled around, they were not at the summit, they were in the death zone. One of the climbers who was with Paljor was the commander, and so at 3 p.m. when they were supposed to stop and turn around, he was at the very back of the climbing stack. And so he stopped and he yelled up to Paljor and the others and tried to get them to stop too so they could go back down, but either they didn't hear him or they just ignored him. Already suffering from frostbite and totally exhausted, he could not go any farther, so he grabbed his radio and he tried to hail them to tell them to stop and come back, but they didn't pick up their radio. And so the commander, after waiting for a few minutes, knew he had to go back down, and so he turned and began the descent. About 30 minutes later, the commander's radio crackled on again, and it was Paljor and the others, and they were informing him that they were going to make a push for the summit. They were about an hour away. And the commander said, "Stop, turn around, I'm ordering you to come back down. The weather is only getting worse." But whether they were suffering from summit fever or overconfidence, we don't know. But regardless, they refused. Frustrated and terrified for the other climbers, the commander just continued down the mountain. But 2.5 hours later, his radio crackled again, and this time it was Paljor and the others saying they had made it. They were standing on the summit of Mount Everest. The men had not just set a record for India, they had brought immeasurable honor to their country. The news sparked a huge celebration down in the base camp and also in the city of Leh, which is where the border police were located. But the party atmosphere would not last long. Shortly after the victory call, the weather turned from bad to horrible. What would later be known as the blizzard of 1996 had arrived in full fury, and by midnight that night, no one had heard from Paljol or the other 2 people he was with. And just a couple of days later, rescue climbers would confirm all 3 men had died. In the years following Paljol's death on the north face of Mount Everest, this hopeful and proud young Indian has become a sort of gruesome celebrity and landmark for the thousands of climbers that make it up into the death zone. Except now he's widely known on the internet and amongst people who are passionate about climbing the world's highest peak, not as Paljor, one of the first Indians to climb the north face of Mount Everest, but as Green Boots, which is a reference to the bright neon green boots he was wearing when he died. For more than 20 years, he's laid near the top of Mount Everest in a small limestone cave, wearing an orange parka and blue pants, and he's curled on his side with his arms wrapped around him like he's trying to keep himself warm. Since his death, anyone climbing the north face when the snow cover is light would literally have to step over his body to get to the top. But Paljor is not the only dead body on Mount Everest. There are over 200 other dead climbers littering the slopes of the world's highest peak. It's just too dangerous and too expensive to try to get them down, and so they stay wherever they died. Which means if you climb Mount Everest, you will literally be climbing over dead bodies on your way to the summit. But of all the bodies on Mount Everest, the most famous by far is Paljor. Here is an image of Paljor, aka Green Boots. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please build up the like button's self-confidence and convince them to run for student body president. Help them with their speech, help them hand out flyers, and then on the big day, don't vote for them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In 2016, 21-year-old Darren Mitchell was living in Southeast Texas in a town called Navasota. He was serving in the U.S. National Guard, he was the proud father of a 1-year-old little girl, and he was engaged to the little girl's mother. Anyone that knew Darren knew his main goal in life was to support his little beloved family. While he personally really wanted to go to a trade school, he ended up putting his dream on hold to raise money so his fiancée could go to nursing school. And their plan was after she completed nursing school, Darren would then raise more money and go to school himself. That spring, Southeast Texas was hit with record rainfalls. It seemed like for Darren, every time he went to and from work, the sky was always gray and the road was always wet. But of all the thunderstorms that passed through that area that year, there was none more powerful than the 24-hour thunderstorm that began on May 26th. That afternoon, Darren was on his way home from work. He was traveling along Texas State Highway 105. It was raining so hard that his windshield wipers literally could not keep up with the amount of water hitting his windshield. And so he eventually just had to slow way down just to make sure he didn't crash into anyone. He looked around him and the fields and the ditches next to the road were already filling with water because the ground was already completely saturated from all the rainfall over the past couple of months. Before long, Darren found himself stopping right in the middle of the highway behind this huge row of traffic. Apparently there was some significant flooding up ahead on the road and people were hesitant to drive through it. And so after a while, when this huge row of traffic was just not moving and the rain was just continuing to pour down, Darren started to worry he might be in an emergency situation, that this could be a flash flood scenario. And so he called his brother and he told him that he was stuck on Highway 105 because there was flooding up ahead, there was flooding behind him, he couldn't really go anywhere. And so his brother asked him, what are you going to do? And at some point Darren said, hey, I can actually get out my window, so I'm fine, I'll talk to you later. But after that, nobody heard from Darren. And later that afternoon, when Darren didn't make it home, his family got really concerned and they called the police. And so that night, a search was launched to find Darren, but there was no sign of him. But the next morning, they did discover Darren's blue pickup truck. It had flipped over. It was off the side of the highway near a river that had been created by the floodwaters. Darren was not inside of the vehicle, but 24 hours later, they did discover his body. He had drowned and he had drifted 1 mile downstream of his truck. The family was obviously devastated by this horrible loss, but they just could not reconcile how he had been on the phone with his brother saying that he was going to be just fine to just a couple days later being found dead. And it would turn out there was actually a witness that watched what happened to Darren. She had been caught up in this flash flood as well, except she was in a vehicle that did not get swept away. And so she was watching Darren as the floodwaters raged around his vehicle, and she said he climbed out of the window and he got into the bed of his pickup truck, and then from the bed he moved up to the roof of his truck, and at this point the waters began pulling his vehicle, and so his vehicle became unsteady, and from her perspective it seemed like Darren did not like his odds on the roof of his truck, and so he climbed back inside of his truck. And then just a couple of minutes later, his vehicle was dragged into a deeper section of the water and it flipped upside down and was pulled under, and Darren did not reemerge. With this information, Darren's family was able to figure out that when Darren climbed back into his truck right before it flipped over, he posted something to Facebook that now, looking back at it, is unbelievably haunting. Randy Weaver was a college dropout and a former Army Green Beret, which is the Army Special Forces. He and his wife Vicky were religious fundamentalists and deeply distrusted the government and believed the end of the world was imminent. In the early 1980s, they began hoarding guns and began making plans to live in some secluded area off the grid. In 1984, Randy, Vicky, and their children moved into a cabin they had built themselves overlooking Ruby Creek in Idaho. By choice, they had no electricity and no water. After receiving information that Randy had made threats against the president, Ronald Reagan, and other government officials, the FBI and the Secret Service began investigating him. Although no charges were ever filed against him, in their investigation, they discovered he had ties to the Aryan Nation, which is a white supremacist group. So in 1989, when Randy inadvertently sold 2 illegal weapons to undercover ATF agents, they said, instead of arresting you and sending you to jail, you can actually become an informant on the Aryan Nation. But Randy said he wasn't tied to the Aryan Nation and couldn't do that, and so they indicted him for making and keeping illegal weapons. After being released on bail in 1991, Randy missed his court date, and so a warrant was issued for his arrest. The U.S. Marshal Service was now responsible for bringing Randy in, but given his significant weapon arsenal and his anti-government stance, they assumed he would not go easily. And so they decided they would launch a secret surveillance campaign of Randy, his family, and where they lived to gain some intelligence on what they did day to day and find the right time to go up and apprehend him. So in early 1992, secret surveillance teams were set up all around the Weaver family cabin, and what they found was the Weaver family, despite being extremist, they mostly kept to themselves, and they definitely were not aware they were being watched. The only reason the marshals didn't just go up and apprehend him was because anytime the Weavers were outside of their cabin, they were always armed. A few months later, in August, as the surveillance teams were getting ready to set up for the day to gather more intelligence on the Weavers, the Weaver dogs took notice of the surveillance teams and started charging into the woods barking like maniacs. And Randy, along with his friend Kevin Harris that was staying with them, and Randy's teenage son Sammy, took off after the dogs, not knowing that they were going to be running straight into a government surveillance team. And when these 2 parties encountered each other, a firefight ensued that left Sammy, Randy's son, dead, along with their dog dead, and one of the marshals, William Deegan, was killed as well. Who shot first and who shot whom would later be hotly debated by all the survivors in the courts and in the media. Immediately after the shooting stopped, Randy and Kevin turned around and ran back up to the cabin to take cover. Meanwhile, the surviving marshals ran out of the forest and they told their boss what had happened, and their boss is like, this is going to turn into a standoff, we need this to end right now. And so he called the FBI and he painted a picture of the Weaver family and Randy specifically as this enormous threat, that it had been this unprovoked attack on the marshals and that they got to come in force to put an end to this thing. And so the next day, hundreds of FBI agents, huge vehicles and helicopters, they all showed up in this little area in Idaho getting ready to do battle with the Weaver family. Because the FBI had been told the Weaver family was this huge threat, they authorized all of their snipers to shoot any armed adult without warning them. Normally, the FBI, if they see someone who's armed, they would yell at them to stop what they were doing, put their weapon down, warn them. Unless, of course, this person is actively shooting at them, then of course the FBI is going to shoot back. But if it's just an armed person standing there, the FBI can't just engage them. But in this situation, the FBI said, this threat is so big, we're changing the rules. And so you had all these FBI snipers all around the Weaver property that are all amped up, they're getting ready to engage the enemy, they're off safe, finger on trigger, slack out, ready to engage the first adult they see. And so it stayed like this for quite a while, a total stalemate, until Randy, Kevin Harris, and Randy's teenage daughter Sarah decided to leave their cabin and go down to Sammy to pay their respects. But Randy and Kevin were carrying weapons, and so after they left the cabin, they walked a little ways away, and then snipers opened up on them. In that initial volley of fire, only Randy got hit in the shoulder, and so Randy, Kevin, and Sarah, they turn, they start running back towards the cabin to take cover, and standing in the doorway of the cabin, inside the cabin, is Vicky, Randy's wife, and she's standing there holding their 10-month-old daughter, and so Randy makes it inside, Sarah makes it in the front door, Kevin is the last one to go through the door, and right as he's going through the doorway, the sniper had his sights set on Kevin, and he fired, he missed Kevin, the round went through the door, and it hit Vicky squarely in the head, and it killed her instantly. Adding insult to injury, the FBI did not know they had just killed their mother, and so after the shooting stopped and the door had shut and the Weavers are back inside the cabin, the FBI began calling out to them saying, Mrs. Weaver, come out, don't you want to protect your kids? Come out and we'll get you guys pancakes and you can sit with your kids. You got to get them out of there. But Vicky was dead, they just didn't know. Ultimately, the FBI went out and got a highly decorated Vietnam War veteran who had similar views to Randy, and they sent him in to try to convince Randy to stop this and surrender, and eventually he got Randy to do that, so no more blood was shed. Later, an investigation would show law enforcement that was handling this case made a number of really critical mistakes early on, the first big mistake being the miscommunication between the marshals to the FBI about how big of a threat the Weaver family really posed. Now, they certainly were a threat, but they were not such a big threat that they required hundreds of FBI agents and helicopters and armored vehicles. The second critical mistake was when the FBI authorized their snipers to shoot at armed adults without a warning. That's almost certainly why Vicky was killed. In the end, despite having a plethora of charges against him, jurors decided that Randy Weaver was only guilty of not showing up to that court date. Amid intense federal scrutiny of the Ruby Ridge scandal, the FBI's number 2 person was demoted, 3 other agents were suspended, and 1 was sent to jail for trying to cover up the mistakes the FBI had made during this case. As for the Weaver family, they were given a $3.1 million settlement by the government, and Kevin Harris had all charges dropped against him, and he won a 6-figure settlement. Of all the pictures that came out of Ruby Ridge, there's none more famous than this one taken by one of the surveillance teams of Vicky just before she was shot by that sniper. Scattered across the North American continent are many ghost towns, places that used to be vibrant and alive that are now dead and abandoned. In these places, you can find old churches and buildings and schools that are usually in a pretty significant state of decay. The reasons a town might die varies. Sometimes it's because a new railroad or highway is put in that bypasses the town, or the town has just exhausted all of their natural resources, which were the original draw to the town. Mining towns are a good example of that. Other reasons are wars, natural disasters, political wranglings. There's a whole bunch of reasons why towns just suddenly stop existing. But there's one ghost town in North America that has a really unique and very dark reason for why it ultimately was abandoned, and that town is Portlock, Alaska. Portlock, which is also called Port Chatham, is located on the farthest southwestern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. It's easily one of the most beautiful areas in all of Alaska, but it also happens to be very remote. And Portlock specifically, even by Kenai standards, is considered extremely remote. You can only get there by boat or by bush plane. The town was technically founded in 1787 when Captain Nathaniel Portlock of the Royal Navy landed there, but it wasn't really turned into a real settlement until the early 1900s when commercial fishermen built a cannery there. By 1921, the town's fishing economy was doing so well that the US government believed they would be the next major commercial fishing hub, and so they actually established a post office there. Everything seemed to be going great for Portlock until the 1930s when rumors began seeping out along the Kenai Peninsula that there was something wrong with Portlock. Men from this cannery town were going missing at an alarming rate, and the few that were found again were always found dead and mutilated in a nearby lagoon. Initially, the townspeople believed these were bear attacks, but the natives of the Kenai Peninsula that found out about what was happening in Portlock, they stopped by and they said, those are not bear attacks. Those are almost certainly attacks by a creature we call the Nantina, which means half man, half beast. And they are tall, two-legged, hairy creatures that live in the forest right near you. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore. But when you consider the fact that from 1930 to 1950, dozens of Portlock residents disappeared in that forest or were violently killed and then dumped in the lagoon right outside of the forest, it makes you wonder what's in the forest. But since none of the people who went missing were ever found alive again, there was never any good description of what it was that was causing them to disappear in the first place. Well, with the exception of one case. In 1943, John Meyer, who was a resident of Portlock, was at his campsite and he was crouched down when he felt something leap onto his back and start pummeling his head and hitting him on the side, and he kind of went into the fetal position, and then at some point his dog started barking and caused whatever was on his back to get scared and run off, and so John, who's been badly beaten, rolls over and he looks towards the tree line and he sees this enormous, tall, hairy man running into the woods. And so John gets up and he stumbles his way into town to try to get help, and he's able to tell someone what happened to him before he ultimately succumbs to his injuries and dies. After the John Meyer incident, another group of Portlock men were up in the forest doing some hunting when they discovered these enormous 18-inch long tracks, and they followed them to a clearing where it looked like there was this epic death struggle, that clearly two huge animals had gotten into a struggle here. There's blood everywhere, there's pieces of what looked like a bear or maybe a moose, and then these tracks continued out of this clearing and went right up the mountain, and the men did not dare follow those tracks to see whatever it was that emerged victorious in this clearing. Even the Alaskan newspapers began speculating that something was off about Portlock. This was more than just some crime being committed, that there's something happening there that we can't understand. And so by 1949, when people were still going missing mysteriously in the forest, and then other people were turning up dead and mutilated in the lagoon, the townspeople said, enough. This is an unsafe place to live. We don't know what's causing this, but we have to leave. And then practically overnight, the town evacuated, leaving behind most of their possessions. The only person that stayed a little bit longer was the postmaster, because he had to wait for the post office to be shut down. And he said it was horrifying that he would see things walking in the trees, and he would hear these horrible sounds, and so he was eager to get out of there. And so in early 1950, he was allowed to go, and then that was it. The population of Portlock went down to 0. After they left, none of the people from Portlock or any of their family members ever went back to Portlock. So the only people that have really ever gone back to Portlock are people that unfortunately wound up there, like in the 1970s when some fishermen got caught in a storm, and so they sought refuge in Portlock. But after setting up their camp, they saw something huge walk past them in the tree line, and it apparently was so terrifying that they literally packed up their camp, went back in their boat, and then went back out into the storm to avoid whatever it was they saw. Besides the fishermen, the only people that have gone to Portlock are people that want to come face to face with whatever it is that drove the people out of that town. But to put in perspective how few people do that, there's almost no modern photographs or videos of Portlock. But there is one very eerie modern photograph of this building that's right in the heart of Portlock. It's one of the very few buildings that didn't collapse, and it's located right next to the forest where many of the men who went missing were last seen. And it's also not far from the lagoon where many of the dead men and dead people that were taken were found. And even if you don't believe there's some Nantina running around the forests of Portlock, you have to understand that something was killing and taking these people in the forest that you are looking at right now. And to date, we still have no idea what it was. Which means this is one of the creepiest pictures you will find on the internet. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please dress the like button in a realistic bear suit and then send them to the next Omante ritual in Japan. 21-year-old Deanna Wild had just separated from her husband, and she was living with her two friends, Virginia and BJ McGinnis, who were both 54 years old. On April 2nd of that year, the trio decided to visit Big Sur, which is the very beautiful but very steep and dangerous section of the Central California coastline. They pulled over at a particular cliff overlooking the water to take some pictures. Afterwards, as they were getting ready to go back to their car, Deanna wanted a closer look, so she stepped to the edge of the cliff where she lost her footing and she fell 500 feet to her death. It was ruled an accident, so investigating officers refrained from taking any on-scene photographs, accepting instead Virginia's photographs that she said she had taken right before it happened. Deanna's mother was unable to afford a funeral for her daughter, and so the only person she could think to ask to help her was a lawyer that went to the same church as her. His name was Steve Keeney, and Steve said, yeah, of course, I'll try to make some phone calls for you and see what I can do. And in doing so, he wound up learning about the case, about what happened to Deanna, and he discovered that her two friends, Virginia and BJ, had actually taken a life insurance policy out on Deanna the day before she fell off the cliff. And so Steve began digging into the backgrounds of Virginia and BJ, and he discovered that Virginia had a history of being around a high number of accidental deaths and suspicious fires, and that she had cashed in a whole bunch of life insurance policies. So all of a sudden, Deanna's death did not look accidental. Steve would become obsessed with the idea that the McGinnises were behind Deanna's death, but unfortunately, there was virtually no evidence to support that, because when she died, the investigating officers ruled it an accident. So there was no crime scene, there was no evidence collected, the autopsy was very cursory. And so Steve would spend 5 years building a case against Virginia and BJ, but at the end of those 5 years, it was a rock-solid case, and Virginia and BJ were arrested. During their trial, the real story of what happened to Deanna finally emerged. On that April day in 1987, the trio went to Big Sur, and they had lunch together, they had a picnic, and while they were eating, BJ slipped some of his prescription antidepressants into Deanna's drink, and so after lunch, the drugs were in Deanna's system, and she began to get very drowsy, to the point where Virginia and BJ had to literally hold her up. She was falling over. She was so tired. And so while Deanna's in the state, Virginia and BJ tell her, hey, let's go over to the cliffs and take some pictures. And so they walk over, Deanna's stumbling and BJ's holding her up, and they get to the edge of the cliff, and BJ turns around so the ocean's at his back, and he's propping up Deanna, and Virginia steps away and she takes their picture. And then right after that picture, BJ, while still holding Deanna, turned around to face the water and kind of carried Deanna right to the edge, and Virginia took one more picture of them facing the water. And then right after that picture was taken, BJ took Deanna and threw her off the cliff. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this case is that as soon as he threw her off, Deanna kind of came to and whipped herself around and managed to grab onto the cliff with her hands. And so she's literally dangling, holding onto this ledge like in the movies, begging to be pulled back up. And Virginia and BJ, instead of helping her back up, picked up rocks and bashed her hands until she fell off the cliff. Ultimately, it would be these last two pictures that Virginia took that got her and BJ convicted of killing Deanna, because these pictures clearly showed Deanna was impaired compared to the earlier pictures on the camera roll. And the only reason these pictures existed is because Virginia wanted a trophy from the killing, because she was actually an uncaught serial killer that went around killing people and cashing in their life insurance policies. One of her victims even included her own 3-year-old daughter. BJ would actually die during his trial. As for Virginia, she was found guilty and sent to jail for life. Here are the final two pictures that Virginia took of Deanna. On July 30th, 2016, Janice Stewart was at home in College Station, Texas, preparing for a wedding she was going to be photographing the following week. Her 34-year-old daughter, named Sunday Rowan, lived a few hours away in San Antonio, and she was planning to go with her to help her take these pictures. As Janice worked, her cell phone kept buzzing. Since sunrise, Sunday had been Snapchatting her photos of her and her husband Matt, who was also 34, as they got ready for their hot air balloon ride that day. 18 months earlier, Sunday had bought Matt the tickets as a birthday gift, but the trip kept getting delayed because of bad weather. But on this July morning, the weather had cleared up and the trip was finally happening. Sunday and Matt often sought adventure to balance the demands of their jobs. Matt was the chief of clinical trials at the Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio and was a rising star in the field of burn research. Sunday worked at Crazy 8, which was a kids' clothing store, and she was devoted to her young son from a previous relationship. At 6:58 that morning, Janice received an image of the balloon's ground crew prepping the wicker basket that would hold her daughter, her son-in-law, and the rest of the other passengers. Around 7:30, Janice received another image. This one was a selfie of Sunday and Matt posing inside of the wicker basket. They were up in the air. There's a beautiful field below them. They're smiling and they're hugging. After that, the messages stopped. 10 minutes later at 7:40, 85-year-old Buddy Miller was making breakfast in his ranch when he heard two loud explosions. The first one actually rattled his house. When he looked out the window, he saw this massive plume of black smoke on another rancher's land off in the distance. Alarmed, he jumped in his pickup truck and raced past his cows to the blaze a half-mile away. Commotion like this rarely occurred in Maxwell, Texas, a quiet rural community about 40 miles south of Austin. At her home just up the road was 66-year-old Margaret Wiley, who heard the explosions too. She said the first one reminded her of the sound her 20-gauge shotgun made. When she stepped onto the porch, she heard the second explosion, and she said it sounded like a loud pop, followed by a whooshing sound, like the sound a gas stove makes when it ignites. When she looked out towards where the sounds had come from, she saw this massive fireball explode in the distance, and she immediately called 911. When Buddy and the other first responders arrived at the scene, they saw this huge fire at the base of a power line tower, and at first they couldn't figure out what was actually burning. They heard the sound of hissing propane tanks and thought maybe it was a tractor or a baler that had caught on fire. But upon closer inspection, they saw a wicker basket and they saw bodies. This was a hot air balloon accident. It would turn out the pilot of that hot air balloon was 49-year-old Skip Nichols, and he had elected to fly that day despite a low cloud cover that had grounded the other hot air balloon companies in the area that morning. Also, Skip was on a mixture of prescription and over-the-counter drugs that impaired his ability to fly the balloon safely. After being in the air for 8 miles above the clouds, Skip decided it was time to land, and so he blindly descended through the clouds and he immediately hit a power line. An arc carrying 340,000 volts of electricity cut the balloon's metal support cables like a torch. As soon as the basket began plummeting toward the earth, the fuel lines disconnected from the burners overhead, spraying liquid propane up into the burners and then arced back down into the wicker basket, immediately engulfing the entire thing in flames. The burning basket fell over 100 feet to the ground. By 10 a.m. that morning, Janice had still not not heard from her daughter after that last text she sent, which included the picture of her and Matt, that selfie image up in the balloon. And Janice was concerned that something had gone wrong. So she turned on the TV, and the first thing she sees is hot air balloon crash in Texas, no survivors. And on the screen, she immediately recognized the smiley face that was on the balloon that had crashed, because she recognized it from the images her daughter had sent her. Even before she got the official call, she knew instinctively that her daughter and her son-in-law were both gone. Here are the final pictures taken of Sunday, Matt, and the other 14 people who were on board that balloon. On September 25th, 1978, a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727 jet airliner entered San Diego airspace. Like all PSA aircraft, Flight 182 had a whimsical black button nose and smiley face painted underneath the cockpit. These so-called grinning birds were synonymous with the company's self-promoting ad campaign about them being the world's friendliest airline. But the airline was often criticized for being too friendly with their super low airfares, their kind of comic banter that the captains would employ through the intercom to passengers, and their female flight attendants who wore miniskirts and were instructed to make nice with the male passengers. Because the weather was clear, air traffic control directed Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox to switch from instrument flight rules to visual flight rules procedures and to begin their final descent. Visual flight rules refers to pilots using their eyes to guide the plane. It's done when they're flying low, the weather's clear, and they can see the ground. At 8:59 a.m. that morning, as PSA Flight 182 descended down to 4,000 feet, air traffic control advised them of a Cessna, which is a small plane, that was ascending in their direction. Fox responded that they saw the Cessna, and so air traffic control came back and said to maintain visual separation. Maintain visual separation meant that despite ground radar-based controllers who could provide vertical and lateral separation criteria, the burden for maintaining separation fell solely on Captain McFerrin and his crew. In layman's terms, air traffic control was telling them, don't lose sight of the Cessna. Inside the Cessna was a flight instructor named Martin Casey and his student, who was a United States Marine named David Boswell. As this little plane ascended, air traffic control informed them that PSA 182, who was right in front of them and slightly above them, they were on their descent. However, they had the Cessna in sight. As a result, the men inside of the Cessna did not take it upon themselves to actively begin looking for this jet. They assumed the pilots of PSA 182, who had them in sight, would avoid them. Back in PSA 182, there seemed to be some confusion in the cockpit. The two pilots were debating whether the Cessna they were watching fly lower than them, past them on the right, was the same Cessna that air traffic control had told them about. And at some point they agreed, yep, that's got to be the same Cessna. And so they called in to air traffic control that it looks like the Cessna has passed us. They've flown past us on the right. Immediately after this transmission, the black box recorded the two pilots talking to each other, basically trying to convince the other that yes, that was definitely the right Cessna. But after a couple of minutes of reassuring themselves, one of them says, boy, I hope that was the right Cessna. According to later testimony by the air traffic controller who was in communication with the pilots of PSA 182 as they were on their final descent, he would say when Captain McFerrin came over and said the Cessna has passed him on the right, he believed him and he didn't think to check to make sure it was the right one. But in reality, the Cessna that McFerrin and Fox had seen was the wrong one. The real Cessna they were supposed to maintain visual separation with, the one containing Casey and Boswell, was still ascending in the direct flight path of PSA 182, except now this Cessna is in 182's blind spot below their nose, so they literally can't see each other. At 9:01 that morning, air traffic control got an alarm that PSA 182 and this Cessna are about to collide, but for some reason the air traffic controller did not alert both aircraft. Instead, this controller only contacted the Cessna and didn't tell them this was a dire situation. They said, hey, there's traffic in your vicinity, but I'm pretty sure it's just PSA 182 and they already see you, so you're fine. So Casey and Boswell inside of the Cessna just continued to ascend. 1 minute later at 9:02 a.m., PSA 182 flies directly over the Cessna and strikes them with their nose wheel. The Cessna gets hooked by the wheel and flips upside down and gets trapped underneath the right wing of the jet. Seconds later, the Cessna splits in two. The tail section containing David Boswell plummets to the earth like a rag doll. The nose section of the Cessna that contained Martin Casey stayed trapped underneath the right wing for a few seconds before it detonated. Inside of PSA 182, this explosion was deafening, and immediately after it, McFerrin was recorded saying, easy baby. Then he asks Fox, what's the damage? And Fox says, it's bad, man, we're hit. Despite trying to keep the plane flying level, it lurched forward into an unrecoverable nosedive, and McFerrin, knowing they were doomed, calmly calls out to air traffic control and says, we're going down. Air traffic responded, okay, we'll have the equipment ready for you. Then the black box recorded the sound of a stall warning inside the cockpit, and as the aircraft streaked at over 300 miles per hour straight towards the ground, McFerrin's last known transmission to air traffic was, this is it, baby. Seconds before impact, McFerrin gave his final command over the intercom, which was, brace yourselves, and then right before the black box cut out, someone in the cabin yelled, I love you, Mom. At 9:03 a.m., PSA 182 slammed nose first into the ground just outside of downtown San Diego in an area called North Park. The resulting explosion of thousands of gallons of jet fuel sent a shockwave that was registered 2 miles away. Almost immediately, firefighters were rushing towards the rising mushroom cloud of black, oily smoke, and many of the first responders that arrived at the crash site in those first few hours were deeply disturbed at what they saw. The bodies that had not been destroyed in the explosion had gotten trapped up in the trees. All told, 144 people were killed in this accident. 135 were from PSA 182, 2 were from the Cessna, and 7 were just unlucky people that were standing on the ground in North Park. Following a 1-year investigation into the mid-air collision, it was determined that the flight crew of PSA 182 was found to be primarily responsible because there was that moment that was picked up in the black box where the two pilots were unsure if the Cessna that passed them was the right one, but instead of calling that into air traffic control and getting confirmation, they blew it off. The morning of the crash, a San Diego photographer was at a press event when he heard the explosion overhead, which was 182 colliding with the Cessna, and he began taking pictures, and he captured these now 2 infamous photos of PSA 182 seconds before they hit the ground.